Welcome everybody, this is a third section of our Docker course. In this section we'll be looking at the topic of packaging software for distribution. We'll start from creating Java Spring application, then we'll be Dockerized then. We will build our own Docker file for that Java application. Next, we'll be using Docker Maven plugin from IntelliJ IDEA to compose our Spring app with Docker. At the end, we will try to understand Docker images and layers and how they help with creating volumes that could be stateful. And this is a first video of this third section, and in this video we'll be building Java Spring based REST microservice that then will be Dockerized. Firstly, we'll create a simple Spring Java project. We'll create a simple controller and we'll be testing that controller. Then we will use that simple project and we'll try to execute some kind of request against that project, and that project will be run inside of a Docker container. So let's start from looking at the maven pom.xml file. So we are defining that our artifact ID will be Spring Boot Docker, version is 0.1.0, and we need to package that to jar file, because that jar file will be put inside of a Docker container. We need to define two dependencies that will be needed in that application. First is a Spring Boot Starter Web. It will be used to create REST controller. And second is Spring Boot Starter Test. We need to create some kind of integrational test, and we want to start whole Spring context in that integrational test. And that's why we need also dependency Spring Boot Starter Test. But as you can see here, we are defining that scope of this dependency is test, so it will be visible only in test. We also defining Maven dependency plugin. That dependency plugin is fetching whole dependencies and putting them into jar file. We need to have all needed dependencies in jar file because that jar file needs to be self-contained. That jar file will be put in Docker and no additional dependencies will be needed. So entry point to our application is class application. It is annotated with Spring Boot application, so it needs to have a main method. Main method, it just starts Spring application and invoke the run method, passing application class, so itself, and some arguments, because we can pass multiple arguments to the main method in Spring application, and we need to proxy them to Spring application, because for example, if we will pass a profile environment like test, dev or production, it will be proxied to Spring, and Spring will select a proper profile and proper application YAML file. Next, we are leveraging that we created a Spring web application, so we are creating a new controller. We are calling it home controller, and request mapping will be just a slash. So if we will enter our application on the default path, so for example we will start our application on port 8080, we don't need to type any kind of REST path, and it will return a hello Docker word. That string will be returned and it will be displayed in our web browser. Every Spring application needs to have application.yaml defined, and the most important property is server port. It is 8080. So when we will start our application inside of a Docker, it will use that specific port. So our application will start on the port 8080. We also give some kind of a name to our application because every Spring application needs to have a name as well. At the end, let's create an integrational test for our controller to assert that everything works as expected. If we will know that everything works as expected, then we will be able to create a Docker file that will be used, and that Spring application will be started inside of a Docker. We are creating a Hello World configuration test and we are running it with Spring Runner. This will create a whole Spring context, and that's why we needed that dependency to Spring test. Next, we are starting our server on some kind of random port, and that port is defined here and it will be injected to this specific field. So we don't need to worry that some kind of port will be already occupied. There will be no already binned exception because the random free port will be chosen. We are injecting REST template, and this is an implementation of the test REST template. We'll be using that REST template to send a GET request for a specific controller. Here we are using REST template and we are getting first the entity. So we are getting on our local host and port that was injected by Spring here. We don't need to know what kind of port is it. The response type should be of type string, because as we remember, our controller has response type just hello Docker world, and this is a string. After that, we are asserting that our response entity status was OK, so it was 200. So let's start our test. We can see that our application works as expected, and we are ready to package that jar file inside of a Docker container.